Next, I'd like to talk about the idea of using debt as money. We already discussed in earlier videos the idea that debt could be represented by small portable tokens that would allow us to make a claim on assets that were being held in some particular location or by an individual. For instance, receipts from a granary or from a state treasury. We saw this, for example, in the Sung dynasty's use of the jiaoyan commodity vouchers on their northern frontier during the 11th century. In general, the more reliable that those promises of future repayment are, then the more valuable and more stable the value of these kinds of promises to repay are to people. And if they are predictable enough and retain enough value, and we don't have to go through too much evaluation of the risk of default, then these kinds of debts may actually begin to circulate as a form of currency, allowing us to transfer debts between different individuals to settle up payments. This is actually the foundation of what we call the Hawala system of financial intermediation, which emerges in northwest India approximately 14 to 15 centuries ago. Prior to that, we even see earlier indications in a book called the Arthashastra, which was written regarding the economic successes of Indian emperor or Mauryan emperor, more specifically Chandragupta, around the 2nd century BC. It was revised several times over the next 500 years, and then lost for almost 1,000. But we've been able to recover copies of it in the last 100 years and translate it. And they do make very specific reference to things called adesas, which effectively are bills of exchange, meaning a transferable debt obligation. So you can explore these two things at the link at the bottom of the first slide that's related to this particular topic. But the idea of a transferable debt is really old. Again, the Goatsman text points out that the Sumerians and the ancient Babylonians were well developed along this path centuries before the Arthashastra gets written. As early as the 18th century BC, we have archaeological evidence of a man by the name of Dumuzi Gamil who borrowed 500 grams of silver, effectively a mina of silver, in 1796. This debt was later resold to two other investors who collected on it in full 5 years later as had been contracted. Now, as we discussed earlier, a silver loan due 5 years later would have been valued at twice the amount that had been originally borrowed. And this, of course, means that Dumuzi Gamil had 5 years in which to make use of his money and to more than double it. In general, what he did with these funds was in turn lend them back out, as we're going to see when we discuss banking in our next major series of videos. Now, as we move forward in time into the more modern, almost Renaissance period, the late medieval period, we see a significant change in the use of traded debts. Rather than being individual debts that were traded between creditors, what we have is, in fact, government debt, debts by the key intermediary in the economy. So going back to 1172, we find the city of Venice to be embroiled in a particularly expensive and destructive war with their rival city-state of Genoa. In order to prevent their imminent defeat by the Genoese, the city of Venice needs to raise an extraordinary amount of capital in order to be able to outfit their fleet once again and to be able to fight back against the invaders. So how do they finance this? At the end of the day, the Venetian treasury only had so much money in it. And so the Venetian government, which was an oligarchy controlled by the most powerful merchants in the city, decided to institute a required loan or a mandatory loan among the richest citizens of the city. Rather than simply taxing them and taking this as a simple extraction, which would have led to significant pushback among various patricians who would have claimed poverty, instead the city of Venice offered to pay them a 5% interest rate, making it effectively a loan and not a gift or forced grab by the state to acquire use of those resources. Now, of course, these loans were guaranteed by a variety of taxes, which in fact were controlled by the oligarchs of the city, who were, to some extent, lending their money to themselves. But you can see the necessity to try to coordinate a large group here required them to have some kind of incentive to align their interests. While you might argue that everyone should have been interested in protecting Venice, you have to remember that many of these oligarchs owned their own ships and did have the ability to simply cash out and move away if they wanted to. Therefore, there was a need to keep people affiliated with the city and still not pretending to be poor enough that they weren't willing to pitch in for its defense. Now, these loans to the state of Venice were transferable via a ledger that was controlled by the state. Ultimately, these loans outlasted the war with Genoa, and the city of Venice maintained a stable government debt for several hundred years through times of both peace and war. It's worth noting that as a result of this, what became available was the idea that there was a stable form of government promise. In other words, some yield that could be earned by casual investors who did not need to directly manage their investment. So this meant that large organizations, things like charities, trusts, various kinds of religious endowments that needed to generate yield to maintain buildings and services without necessarily having the specialized knowledge to monitor defaults, were able to use this kind of government debt as the foundation of their portfolios. So this, of course, meant that government debt was not just a temporary expedient to overcoming a short-term liquidity problem. Government debt grew to become a foundational asset. And it's interesting to note that in looking at what's called the Needham puzzle, of why industrialism happened in the West as opposed to the East, Goetzmann actually identifies this government debt in Venice as being the first domino that produces the Industrial Revolution. In Goetzmann's take, what we see is that the government debt markets in Venice later become or evolve into corporate or markets for corporate debt, which lays the foundation for corporate markets for equity and other kinds of securities that can be sold not just by governments, but by corporations in order to finance large-scale projects. And this means that there's an opportunity for large-scale coordination outside the purview of the state. And this is what Goetzmann ultimately believes leads to the East and West financial divergence that we see. As an indication of how popular this kind of government debt was quickly, but for that matter, within 2 centuries of the Venetian government first issuing these debts, we see in the city of Florence, just a couple of hundred miles away, that 2/3 of Florentine households own their own city's debt by 1400. Now, of course, being able to mobilize large amounts of capital for the defense of a city can be replicated in peacetime to mobilize large amounts of capital for other issues. For example, financing large navies or colonial ventures, and even later, the Industrial Revolution. So let's talk really quickly about the value and pricing of these kinds of debt securities, because it's important for us, once again, to recognize that there is a difference between the price at which something trades and the underlying value that it represents. So here we have some of the very little bit of math that is in this course. You'll notice that what we have here is a basic time value of money calculation, in which cash flows that are due in the future are discounted back to the present, effectively implying that a promise to pay me $100 next year is worth less to me than having $100 in cash is right now. So based on the risk that we perceive related to a particular cash flow in the future, we would decrease the value of that cash flow as risk increases. And this gives us the underlying value of the debt contract. But as behavioral finance researchers have shown in the last half century, in fact, most people don't behave based off of what real risks actually are. People behave according to what they think the risks are. And this means that the perception of uncertainty around cash flows being received has a very important impact on the market price of these kinds of tradable debts. To show a simple example of how someone was able to take advantage of this, consider the story of Nathan Rothschild and the Napoleonic War in 1815. The Rothschilds were a Frankfurt-based banking family in the late 1700s, and the scion of the family, or sorry, the head of the family, based in Frankfurt, had himself 5 sons who he sent to go and live in different financial centers around Europe, effectively allowing them to create an international banking network where they could borrow from some parts of the continent in order to provide capital in other parts of the continent. So this is exactly the kind of business that famous Nathan Rothschild was engaged in. He was working in England, in London, for the British government, offering to help provide them with the gold that they would need in order to finance a continental war against Napoleon. It's one thing for the local government to, say, print up its own paper currency or tax people, but this has significant delays. If we need to move soldiers from Britain to continental Europe and sustain an extended campaign, then we need to feed, house, and equip those people from the day they land onward. And that generally means having access to some kind of financing that we can use in other places. And in the 1800s, that meant gold. So the Rothschild banking network had borrowed an extraordinary amount of gold from its affiliates all across the European continent in expectation that the British government would be looking to borrow extraordinary amounts in order to fight what they thought would be long wars against Napoleon. However, as you probably know, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, which ended the Napoleonic Wars, which ended Britain's need for a massive amount of gold, which the Rothschilds had prepositioned to lend to them. Now, of course, this creates a serious, serious problem for Nathan, who faces financial ruin. Having borrowed all of this gold from all across Europe at interest, he now finds himself in a position of having a lot of liquid assets, but no particular place to deploy them. And so the Rothschilds were almost ruined by this, but for one interesting turn of events. The story is that Nathan Rothschild had observers watching the Battle of Waterloo who quickly returned to England as fast as possible to report to him on what had been the results of the fighting. Because he received news of British victory at Waterloo before the common investor at the Royal Exchange had received this information, he felt that he had a significant opportunity here to take advantage of this information asymmetry and to profit handsomely between the difference in people's perception of the risk of a government default and the actual risk of a British government default. Now, had the British government lost the war against Napoleon, there was a very strong chance that they would have defaulted on their payments, or that cash flows would have been substantially reduced, meaning that British government debts or a promise to pay in the future would have been substantially less valuable to them. On the other hand, a British victory would lead to a rise in the value of government bonds, as not only the perception of risk, but the real risk associated with repayment unwound itself. So armed with this information about Britain's success versus Napoleon, Nathan sets up a ruse in the Royal Exchange. He decides that he will make a very public show of selling off British government bonds and, moaning so terribly about how he is ruined in very broad public. Seeing this, and most people understanding that the Rothschilds were at least clever operators, if not very powerful operators, began to follow his lead. They assumed that he must have some kind of special information about a British defeat, which is why he was very publicly selling his government debt. However, in secret, he had hired up a pile of different agents to move around the Royal Exchange and to buy up these bonds as they were being sold on his behalf, which meant that the gold originally borrowed to lend to the British government found itself moving into providing liquidity in the bond market. So as news finally did arrive at the Royal Exchange of Britain's victory over Napoleon, the market changed entirely. People's perception of the risk was no longer based on sort of crowd following Nathan Rothschild's very public performance. Instead, it became based off of the facts that were emerging. And so the perception of risk declined dramatically, which mathematically raises the price in the market. And so we actually see the price of British government bonds over the next 24 months rise by 40%. Now, to most people, a 40% trade is pretty good, but it's not really newsworthy. It's not the sort of thing that you would expect to associate with these kinds of famous global bankers. But you have to remember that that 40% that was earned was not just on Nathan or his own bank's personal capital, but a 40% return on all of the money he had borrowed from all over Europe. All of that gold that he had intended to lend to the British government was instead invested into this bond trade. So with enormous leverage, he was able to earn fantastical returns and ends up multiplying the family fortune by more than 100-fold by the end of his bond trade. Now, as we move forward, we notice that government bonds were an absolutely critical kind of financial asset, not just for large endowments as they were in the aftermath of the issuance of Venetian government debt, but these also became foundational assets in the portfolios of various kinds of households. In fact, we note that throughout the Victorian period, there are substantial amounts of very, very wealthy people living in the British Empire who are simply what they call rentiers. They are people who are living off having their ancestors having provided the government of the United Kingdom with money on an emergency basis at some point in the past as the foundation of their current prosperity. Now, of course, this leads to a situation where we have laboring taxpayers paying for people's lifestyle when it was their ancestors who provided money almost 100 years before to save the country. Without getting into any kind of arguments about whether or not that was appropriate or due, it's worth noting that the post-World War I and post-World War II inflations largely destroyed the value of these government promises, what John Maynard Keynes referred to in the 1930s as the euthanasia of the rentier class. But widespread use of government bonds reemerges in the 20th century, particularly in North America, with the direct sale of government savings bonds to the public, whether these are Canada savings bonds or US savings bonds. The idea was to sidestep the bankers to some extent and provide a direct sale of bonds in a non-intermediated fashion. Now, these bonds normally came with tax advantages, the opportunity to redeem them at almost any time, automatic reinvestment of interest without transaction costs, and of course, convenient estate options that allowed you to transfer these assets to beneficiaries without any kind of legal or tax complications. The program began in 1935 in the US to help try to finance the New Deal programs and climb out of the Great Depression. And in Canada, we started this program in 1946 to help us defray the costs associated with our expanding welfare state and repaying the debts that had been incurred, or at least refinancing the debts that had been incurred while we were fighting World War II. Now, today, there are a number of different kinds of tax-sheltered options that we have that have largely done away with the need for these kinds of government savings bonds. Rather than lending your money to the government on a tax-free basis through a direct purchase of a Canada savings bond, instead, you can buy a government-issued bond and simply carry it in your TFSA, where it will accrue in value without having any kind of tax implications. The other technique has largely been to try to shift the constraints on portfolios of financial institutions. Historically, many large institutions, from insurance companies to pension plans, were legally required to invest the money that they had received from beneficiaries into ultra-safe government debts. As we'll see when we discuss pensions, this led to a massive underfunding problem. And in the case of insurance companies, led in many cases to overly concentrated portfolios. So although we have largely done away with these kinds of forced techniques where we try to channel people's household savings directly into the hands of governments, there are still a number of techniques that are used for this. In your pensions, in your investment funds, in your insurance companies, you'll find that in the portfolios of all of these organizations are T-bills or government debts, meaning that despite the fact that our savings are no longer forcibly channeled into the government's pockets, the fact remains that a lot of it still ends up in these very liquid, very secure assets.